Welcome back to another segment of Terminating Low Voltage Cables. I'm Ron with Ideal, and again, welcome to my shop. Now, this is part two of working with UTP cables, and a little bit about the do's and don'ts about how to use them. Now, in part one, we covered a lot about the twisting and pairs and the different categories of cabling that are out there. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the construction of the wire as far as how the National Electric Code looks at it, and then also a little bit about installation tips and things like that. Now, we are always very concerned about how the wire burns in a fire, and because the amount of smoke it puts out can be very toxic to us, and it can be very thick as well, because you can't see through it, so we really don't want that. And so the National Electric Code actually has some designations here for us to look at. Now, when you look at a piece of catenary wire and you pick it up, one of the first things you might see when you look at the cabling, in this case, this wire here gives me so many feet. This is 884 feet, and you'll find a lot of your cable manufacturers, or when they make the wire today, they'll sequentially mark the cabling. So in this case, this tells me there's 884 feet left in the box, which is nice to know if you have enough wire in a box. And of course, then it goes on to say what it is as far as catenary wire radius, those kinds of things. It gives the UL or the ETL people who actually tested the wire and rated the wire for you. It talks about the gauge and the brand and things like that. Now, one of the things else you'll find on the cable is marked on every 2 foot along the length of the wire is some letters that you'll see in a combination of letters you might find. And this is the fire rating of the cables. And when you look at the National Electric Code, the first rating they have out there is something called CMX. And now the X means what we call limited purpose. Okay? And the CM in this case stands for communications grade cabling. The X is where we can use the wire, and sometimes you might find it wired rated at MP, and that's called multi-purpose, so it'd be the same thing. But the X in this case means limited purpose. And in many cases, when I see wire like this out there, especially in residential, I might find it in an indoor-outdoor rated cable. It'll have a rating for the indoor portion of it, and then it'll have a CMX, meaning it's limited purpose and it's outdoor. And in many cases, that wire has some sort of a UV inhibitor in it to keep it from breaking down in the sunlight, the jacketing. So outdoor above ground. Okay. None of these wires are really meant to go in ground, even though the code book says you can put it in conduit in the ground. That will get full of water sooner or later in the conduit. So anyway, so the next rating up above this is CMG, as in general purpose. Okay, and so here CMG is general purpose wire. Okay, now general purpose wire can be ran behind walls or outside of walls, and it can be ran basically horizontally through a building. General purpose wire, if I took a piece of it and caught it on fire and then took the heat source away, it basically stays on fire and can throughout the length of the wire burn basically, and it puts out pretty heavy smoke too, so we're worried about that as well. So the code book will let you go 2 floors with this in residential, but above that we've got to go to the next rung up the ladder, which is riser cable. Okay, so now we have something called CMR on the wire, and it's riser rated wire. Okay. Now, riser can be ran, again, inside or outside of walls, vertically or horizontally through a building. And when we take that wire and we catch it on fire, take the heat source away from it, the flame is supposed to go out with so many inches, and the amount of smoke it's not supposed to put out is as toxic, and again, as dense as general purpose wire. So it burns slower, basically, in a fire. Okay. And that's what you find in most applications you see out there today. And the box will be clearly rated as, riser rated right there on the box. And these ratings are something, again, that your code guys will definitely know about. And the last rating out there is plenum rated wire, or CMP. Now, the word plenum basically refers to anything that handles air in a heating and air conditioning system, so ductworks and things like that. And so if the wire needs to penetrate or go through any place where that wire would have to be in that same area as that air handling device, well, then it needs to be plenum rated wire. And you'll find a lot of commercial jobs are making you put in plenum no matter what, just because, safety reasons kind of. And if your wire is 3 times the price out there, it's probably platinum rated wire. So be careful out there buying wire. It could be platinum or riser. Should be clearly marked on the box, but you'll know it's platinum because the compound that they make the jacketing out of doesn't hold ink very well, and you can actually see it's very kind of faded as far as colors are, and that's one way of spotting it. And the other one is, of course, the price of the cabling. So. You know, again, if the only way to get your wire to a room is going through the air ducts in your house, well, then you might want to go out and buy some of that platinum rated wire to do that with. Okay. Now, the next thing I'm going to talk a little bit about is, you know, how do you install the wire, and some tips on pulling and just general ideas as you route wires through homes. Now, first of all, we generally like to be the last person on a job, especially in a residential job, before the walls go up, because then we can pick routes that no one else is going to mess with. And so when you're setting up a home or any small job or any job you're pulling, one of the first things you need to sit down is take a look at the plans or look at the drawings, and you can start coming up with some ideas how to route these wires to these buildings and how you might go about protecting that wire in the process of doing that too. Because I guarantee if the wire is exposed, it can get damaged or painted or something stupid to it. So, you know, make sure the pulling areas that you're pulling wire from, the area's nice and clean. No other trades are in those areas, and no one's stepping on your wire or doing anything stupid to your cabling during the process of you actually getting it installed inside of a home. Now, pulling tension is something that we do worry about with cat array cabling, and when we look at pulling tension, cat array cabling has always been told us to not pull it at any more than 25 pounds of pressure. So, you know, how do you gauge this? Well, you know, no one actually ever measures it. We assume if you've installed it properly and it passes a certification test, you must have pulled it right. And but we know when we're damaging cables, though, as you're pulling wire around corners and things like that, you know when you're pulling on it too hard, and you don't want to be doing things like that to the cabling. So figure out pulling stations to go from point to point. There are all kinds of means of as far as devices to help get around corners and stuff with, but pulling. Okay. Now the other one is bending and kinking of cabling, and you know when the bending radius on cat array cabling has always been 4 times the diameter of the wire. And you know, a lot of your cat array 5E, your cat 6 stuff will be somewhere around a 1/4 inch in diameter. So 4 times that basically is 1 inch, and that's the diameter of the radius of the bend. So if that's the radius, the diameter of the circle we can create is 2 inches. Okay. So that's about the tightest they want us to bend this wire. And kinking of cable, things like that, is not good. However, we'll tolerate quite a bit of it. It will. Usually, most cases, it's surprising how much kinking of cable and bending that the system actually does withstand. But anytime you deform the shape of the wire, you're messing with the cable's performance. We prefer you just not do it. Okay. Now, slack at the outlets. You know, when we put slack out there, we always like somewhere around 8 to 10 inches of slack above, you know, or 8 to 12 inches, I should say, 8 to 12 inches at an outlet in a room. That way we've got something extra we can re-terminate if we have to later down the road. Or, and again, we're going to use a backless box so that we can push that nice and evenly back into a stud cavity. Above it, in you know, ceilings, you know, if you want to leave a little slack up there, you know, basically 1 foot or so is basically what they're recommending today, not much. We don't leave big service loops like we used to in buildings, okay? All right, now besides that, separation from power, which is obviously a big one. Now, when I look at this, you hear all kinds of numbers and recommendations from people, and I'm going to tell you, the only thing that's law, basically, is the National Electric Code. Now, the NEC basically says 2 inches, and we want to maintain an easy 2 inches away from all electrical devices. And if we're going to cross it, you know, at right angles, don't run, you know, side by side with it, and kind of thing. But it's only 2 inches, and anything else you hear is basically a recommendation by somebody. And when we look at the residential standards, many of those, like the 570B, would also say 2 inches on UTP cabling. It's interesting, they say 6 inches on coax because actually balanced cable like UTP is very good at resisting noise. Now, if you look at some of the commercial standards, you'll see 12 and you'll see 24 inches as well. So really the best answer you give people is as far away as you can get it would be the best thing you want to do. Okay, and when we look at routing the cable and we support the cabling, you know, up and drop ceilings, we'd say every 4 to 5 feet you'd want to support the cabling with some sort of a, you know, J hook or whatever it might be. So every 4 to 5 feet. Again, worry about your routing your cabling. When you're using cable ties, don't cinch them down so tight that they can cause damage to the cabling. You might even alter how often you actually cable time. Doing it every 12 inches or every 2 feet is not always a great idea. Start separating some of those kind of things. Actually, in a lot of your Cat 6A stuff, we're saying to unbundle the wire slightly as we install it as well, because actually this bundling is causing problems in 6A. But support it properly. Again, make sure you don't do any damage to the cable in the process. And you know, like Romex staples and things like that, you might still see people using those. It's not the brightest of ideas. If anything, you hit the wire half the time. And if you want to drive the staple into the wood member, then cable tie the wire to it, well then I'll go with that. But again, don't damage the cable in the process of installing. And of course, all these systems, make sure everything is grounded properly as well throughout that system. So that kind of takes us through the second part of UTP wire and a little bit about how it's manufactured and engineered and some things to think about when you buy it and start pulling and installing those cables. So again, I'm Ron with Ideal. Thanks for coming to another segment, and we'll plan on seeing you the next time.